I grew up in Spring Grove, Illinois, a little German Catholic farming community, about 60 miles northwest of Chicago. And my family has been there for about 5 generations. They came probably in the 1840s. And growing up, I had heard off and on the story, or it seemed to me perhaps like a legend at the time, of a black man buried somewhere in Spring Grove in one of the cemeteries. And there was talk that he had been held in slavery at some time in his life in Tennessee. I probably forgot about that story for years and years, but when I got interested in family history and storytelling, I started digging around a little bit and came across, I was very fortunate to come across an 80-year-old man, Tommy Madden, who had been one of my father's best friends. And Tommy and another acquaintance of his called Jim Haldeman had known this gentleman, this gentleman from Tennessee. They all referred to him as John Henry, which of course was ironic. John Henry is the mythical hero of American black folklore who won the race with a steam hammer. And maybe that's why John Henry took his name, I'm not sure, but he had come out to Spring Grove, a little sidetracked town, come out from Chicago apparently. In fact, the story was that he had left Tennessee, either been emancipated at the time, at the end of the Civil War, perhaps, or had escaped. No one really knew for sure. But he had come out to Chicago, which makes some sense. But he had told everybody that he met in Spring Grove that he found things too sporting in Chicago. So he wanted a quieter place. And if he was looking for a quiet place, he found the right place, Spring Grove. There wasn't much sporting going on. You had 200 people and 4 taverns and 2 churches. That was about it. But he worked for farmers there. He was a hired hand, a live-in hired hand. And he found one family, the Stevens family, that particularly took an interest in him, and he lived with that family and worked with the family for years and years. In fact, he worked often in the farmhouse helping Mrs. Stevens. And the story always was Mrs. Stevens said she just couldn't part with John Henry, that she'd send her husband down the road before she'd let go of John Henry. He was so helpful to her. He loved children. There was a story that he would sit around the big dining room table, a big farm family, and he always liked sitting next to the baby. He liked feeding the baby. And he would read them the newspaper. He couldn't read, but he would hold the newspaper and make up the stories. One of the boys, the youngest, I was told by his brother, just wouldn't go to sleep, wouldn't go to bed until John Henry had helped him, take his boots and shoes off and got him ready for bed. But there was more to the story, of course. Things couldn't have been easy for John living out there, being the only black man for miles around. I remember there's one story where they had a threshing, and there were some day laborers were hired from out of the community to work. There was extra work to do when the grain needed to be threshed. And a couple of these fellows were up high on a straw stack, and they saw John below, maybe working on the machine or oiling the machine or doing some kind of work beneath them, and they got an oil can and they squirted him as a joke. I remember Tommy Madden saying, John didn't complain, he never wanted to bother anybody. Of course, that was the internalized reality of being a slave. If you bothered someone, that might mean your life or your family sold down the river. But when the boss, the man who owned the farm, found out about it, and they gathered for lunch under these big, incredible spreads of food that were prepared for the threshing crews, when the boss, Mr. Stevens, found out, he fired the 2 day laborers on the spot for what they had done because they had humiliated John. And old Tommy was 88 years old when he told me that story. And I remember he was sitting on his couch there on a February afternoon, and he has bib overalls on, and he was telling me that story about these two fellows that had humiliated John being fired, and he kind of raised his fist. Remember, he had a little kind of gunmetal blue nail on that fist. Remember him punctuating that in the air, saying, "That was the end of those fellows, for what they did to John." And he felt a real sense of justice about that. I think perhaps the uniqueness of having someone who had been once held in slavery, the uniqueness of having a black man in their community, there was a certain deference paid to John. But I remember also hearing some of my relatives say that he would dance with the girls at church functions, and some of the people didn't like that. Even with the Stevens family, who he loved and they loved him, they would ask him to come into the front room after dinner in the kitchen, and no, he would always just sit alone in his rocking chair in the kitchen or one of the other rooms, not in the front room. So things must have been lonely for him. But the story, of course, was fascinating, and when I heard Tommy on that day, that February day when I got this story from Tommy, or was collecting stories about John from Tommy Madden, he said, "I know where he's buried." Well, this was new information to me. I had heard he was buried somewhere in the county, but I never met anyone who knew where he was buried. Tom said, "Oh, he's in the old coal cemetery there on Wilmot Road." And he says, "Down along the fence line, over on the northeast corner, you'll find John's grave." Well, it was a February day, and I said goodbye to Lorette and Tommy in Wilmot, Wisconsin, and drove south down Wilmot Road looking for the cemetery, and found it, of course. I knew where the cemetery was. But I walked back and forth amongst those gravestones that late February afternoon, and did not find any John Henry grave. And in thinking about his life, and that he'd been so far away from anything that would have been a familiar experience to him, being held in slavery in Tennessee, far away from family. There was no family that anyone knew of. And I thought, finally, now his grave was gone too, and even the memory was gone, kind of punctuating the loneliness of his life, or that aspect of his life. And I had literally given up looking for the tombstone and was heading back to my car, and I almost stumbled on it. You know how it is when you give up looking for something, that's when you find it. There at my feet was a very proper granite stone. I knew he had died in the county home, and so I had already concluded that perhaps there was no marker at all, that there was a wooden cross that had rotted, or nothing to mark his grave. But there it was, a very proper granite stone. It said John Henry Higler, and he died in 1947, the same year that my grandpa died. To the best of my memory, it was 1947. There on the stone, there was no birth date, because there often was no birth dates recorded for slaves. But there was that very proper stone. In front of that stone was a bright red, fairly new plastic flower. And it occurred to me that those people who lived up there in that prairie, English prairie, north of Spring Grove, had found a way to transcend race and culture and geography, and the monument to that connection that was made across all those challenges was that red rose, that red plastic rose there on that cold February day. And perhaps that's kind of a metaphor to where our country is, our culture. Racism is solid still. It's frozen like the ground was on that February day. But here and there we see these patches of red, these signs of life and flowering. In thinking about it, I thought, well, and now with the last presidential election, we have kind of like a garland in a snowbank. We got Obama in the White House. That's why they call it the White House, I guess. I don't know. So, still there in the Cole Cemetery, John Henry Higler, if you want to go check out the grave.